All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm trusting you all can hear me. It's a great pleasure to get to join you there, if only via Skype. I'm sorry not to be there in person with you. It's one of my favorite places in the world. I guess, the one thing you can say for Skype is that it's low carbon. Look, what you're doing there this weekend could not be more important. You know, I wrote the first book about global warming 23 years ago in 1989. That is to say, before you were born. That's how long we've known about climate change. We knew what we needed to know 20 years ago, really. We knew that when you burn coal and gas and oil, you put carbon in the atmosphere. And we knew that the molecular structure of carbon trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. The only thing we did not know was how fast and how hard it was going to pinch. And the story of my adult life, the story of the last 2 decades, has been watching as it pinched harder and faster than we would have expected. And let me just bring you, just for 1 second, up to date. I know you all know about everything there is to know about climate change, but just to kind of bring you the report from, at 350, we work in pretty much every country around the world except North Korea. So let me bring you the story about just what we hear now every day from someplace around the world. The Earth is coming deeply unbalanced. We've raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree so far, and that means we're trapping about 3/4 of a watt of extra solar energy per square meter of the Earth's surface. That doesn't sound like much, but it turns out to be a lot. The Earth's oceans are about 30% more acid than they were 40 years ago. Everything frozen on Earth is melting, and melting quickly. Maybe most dramatically, especially what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years, are the changes in the Earth's hydrological cycle, the way that water moves around the planet. Here's the one thing always to remember and to try and explain to people, just a basic fact of physics. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That means that because we've raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree, the atmosphere is about 4% wetter than it used to be. That is an enormous change in a basic physical parameter of the planet. We think that that number was more or less stable for the 10,000 years that we call the Holocene. Maybe the best evidence that we've left the Holocene and moved into some other new, as yet unnamed geological epoch is precisely that increase in moisture in the atmosphere. And it means that we have loaded the dice for drought and for flood. And we're seeing both of those in astonishing numbers now around the globe. Just in the last couple of years, I mean, think of what's happened. Summer of 2010, that enormous heat wave across Russia, it cut their grain harvest dramatically and kept the Kremlin got scared and they stopped exporting grain to the rest of the world. In a normal year, Russia is the 3rd biggest grain exporter on the planet. So the price of corn and wheat went up about 70% overnight, and it stayed there since, because we've had crop failures for drought in the North China Plain, in parts of Western Europe, in parts of Australia, disastrously across the Horn of Africa, and most recently on our continent across Texas and Oklahoma, which last year recorded the warmest summers ever seen in the U.S. The drought is deeper than it was during the Dust Bowl. We think that 500 million trees died last year in Texas alone. At the height of the forest fires around the city of Austin in September, the head of the Texas Forest Firefighting Service said, "No human being has ever fought fire in conditions like this." And he was essentially right. The humidity was nearly zero, and the temperature was off the charts. Once that water has evaporated up into the atmosphere, it's going to come down. A water vapor molecule only, on average, stays in the atmosphere about 7 days. And so we've dramatically increased the chances of flood. And again, all over the world we see it. Summer of 2010, it was Pakistan. There's a stretch of the Indus River, a stretch of up above the Khyber Pass there in the mountains that normally gets 3 feet of rain in a year, and it got 12 feet of rain in a week. And that's why the Indus River swelled to the point where it covered a quarter of the country, and 20 million people were homeless. You may remember the pictures from Australia around this time last year of the flooding in Queensland. Then last spring, it was the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers at the highest levels ever recorded. We were having to blow up levees in order to save cities. In the fall, it was the turn for my state, Vermont, here in the Northeast. Hurricane Irene made her way up the East Coast. And as she passed over record warm sea surface temperatures off New York and New Jersey, she soaked up huge amounts of water, which she dumped on Vermont. The damage was unbelievable. We broke our old one-day rainfall records by 25 and 30% and more. That shouldn't really be possible. I mean, we've been keeping rainfall records for 200 years. These were so far off the charts that only explanation is that we're living on a kind of different world than those rainfall records were set on. In the fall after that, it was the turn of Central America. Hundreds of people dead across El Salvador and Guatemala and Nicaragua and Honduras. The president of Honduras saying development's been set back 20 years. Late in the fall, into the early winter, it was in Thailand. The damage from flooding in Thailand, record flooding, was incredibly intense. They think it was equivalent to damage to 18% of the country's gross domestic product last year. That's an astonishing number. When Hurricane Katrina banged into the United States 5 years ago, it did damage equivalent to 0.75% of our GDP. So in percentage terms, it was 25 times as worse in Thailand. And of course, it's always worth bearing in mind when you talk about places like Thailand or Pakistan or El Salvador, that these places have done next to nothing to cause this problem. They don't use enough fossil fuel to be a major source of global warming. The 4% of us who live in this country are responsible for more than a third of the global warming gases currently in the atmosphere, because we've been pushing them out there for so long. And of course, the one other thing to remember is just that all the damage we're seeing comes in the early stages of climate change. We've raised the temperature 1 degree so far, but the climatologists that have been completely right to this point have told us that 1 degree will be 4 or 5 degrees before the century is out unless we get our act together. And by getting our act together, I mean getting off coal and gas and oil far faster than anyone's planning to right now. At the moment, in fact, we're doing next to nothing to get off coal and gas and oil. Their use keeps increasing around the world. Last year saw the biggest one-year increase in the amount of carbon spewed into the atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And the reason, above all, that we get nowhere is because of the financial might of the fossil fuel industry. This is the most profitable enterprise that human beings have ever engaged in. Exxon announced its profit last week for last year, and they made $41 billion. That's more than any company in the history of money, okay? That gives them, in our political system, the ability to block change. And that's what they have done. That's why we have an unbroken 20-year bipartisan record of accomplishing nothing in Washington. And it's why we're going to have to really build a movement to make it stop, a movement for our time, the equivalent of what the civil rights movement was 40 years ago, a movement that takes large numbers of people and asks them to do remarkable things. We only really started trying to build this movement a few years ago. Before then, I think we counted on the idea, I did, that if scientists kept explaining to our political leaders that the worst thing that ever happened in the world was happening, they would do what needed doing. But what we didn't reckon on was the fact that while those scientists were talking in one ear, the fossil fuel industry would be bellowing in the other ear, this kind of mix of threats and promises that have been enough so far to prevent action, to keep bad things happening. We're never going to have the money that those guys have. So we need to find other currencies to work in. And those other currencies are passion and spirit and creativity and numbers. And it's possible to assemble them. You're proof of that right there today. And we've seen the same thing around the world. When we started 350.org in the winter of 2008, we had no money at all. It was me and 7 students at Middlebury College here in Vermont, where I hang out. They were seniors, so they weren't done with school, but they were more or less done with school, if you know what I mean. And we decided we'd set to work. It was a pretty daunting idea to try and organize globally. That's one reason we chose this kind of strange name, this wonky scientific data point. The scientist led by James Hansen at NASA had just put out a paper saying 350 parts per million CO2 was the most we could safely have in the atmosphere. We figured that as long as we were going to work around the world, Arabic numerals would be our ally because they translate across linguistic boundaries. And so that's what we set to work with. There were 7 young people. There are 7 continents. Each one picked one, and we went to work. The guy who got the Antarctic also had to take care of the internet, okay? And off we went to work. And what we found all over the world was great. People, mostly, but not entirely, young people ready to go to work. Now, some parts of the world, they don't call themselves environmentalists, but every part of the world, there are people thinking about how they're going to feed people, war and peace, social progress, women's rights, all the things that you can't have, that no one's working on right now in Thailand because they're just trying to get people high and dry again. You know, all the things you can't have in a destabilizing world. And so those were our allies. And we told everybody we were going to start, and we started with this one big day of action in the fall of 2009. We told everybody, no matter where they were, to do something, and we didn't know how it would go. We got the sense it might work 2 days early, October 22nd. We were sitting around this little office we'd borrowed in downtown Manhattan, and the phone rang, and it was our organizer, one of our 2 organizers in Ethiopia. They were a pair of sisters, 17 and 18 years old. Lily was on the phone. She said, the government took away our permit for Saturday, so we can't do our demonstration with everybody else. We're doing it today, so they can't stop us, and we're really sorry. We don't want to jump the gun. We don't want to spoil it for everybody. We were so looking forward to doing it with everybody else, and we have 15,000 young people right now out in the street in Addis Ababa chanting 350. So I was like, Lily, don't worry about the date. It's okay, you know. For the next 3 days, the pictures just flowed in from all over the world. Before it was done, there had been 5,100 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN said it was the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history. We've gone on from that to do more of these kind of huge days of global action. The last one in the fall that I know some of you helped with was we called Moving Planet Day, and it was built around transportation. And all over the world there were people on bicycles, because bicycles are a part of the solution, and because bicycles are one of the few tools that both rich and poor human beings use. And so it was a great chance to demonstrate that kind of solidarity that we need so badly. We're going to keep doing those things. In fact, May 12th of this year coming up, we're going to do a big day that's all over the world, any place where people have already felt the sting of climate change. We're going to call it Connect the Dots, and there are by now thousands of these dots around the world, places that have seen drought, flood, fire, melt, all the things that are plaguing the planet already. We'll keep doing this kind of educational work. It's really key. We need you involved in it. And I'm afraid we also need to go beyond that too. As this movement has matured, and as we've determined and seen just how tough the fossil fuel industry is as an opponent, we've come to understand also that we're going to need to be not more radical, I'll get back to that word in a moment, but more willing to put ourselves on the line a little bit. Well, I'll tell you about this Keystone thing that we've done this last year. I really got involved. I should have gotten involved in it long ago, because our indigenous brothers and sisters up in Canada have been telling us for a long time what a disaster it is up there where they're mining these tar sands. But there are a lot of disasters going on in the world at any given moment, and it's hard to know which one to be involved in. I got obsessed with this in the spring when Jim Hansen at NASA said, look, that's the second biggest pool of carbon on Earth, those tar sands, after the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. It was burning Saudi Arabia more than anything else that raised the temperature of the planet a degree already. If we find the next Saudi Arabia and just do the same thing, then we're idiots. And so we figured we have to try and do what we can. We sent out a letter. I wrote a letter, and a few of my friends signed onto it, a couple of indigenous leaders, and Naomi Klein and Wendell Berry and other heroes of mine. And we sent it out and just said, come to Washington, we're going to do civil disobedience. And we did not know how it would go. We planned on 2 weeks of sitting in outside the White House. And the very first day, 80 people showed up to be arrested, which was more than we had expected, and it was more than the police had expected. Instead of doing what they normally do, which is take you away in handcuffs and keep you a few hours and fine you, they decided they were going to try and deter us by sticking us in jail. And so some of us got the all expense paid, 3 days in central cell block in D.C., which is exactly as much fun as it sounds like it might be. The good news is it didn't deter us all. Day 2, 100 people showed up. Before the 2 weeks were out, 1,253 people had been arrested, the largest civil disobedience action in this country about any issue for the last 30 years. It was beautiful to see it happen. And then it was beautiful to see the kind of Occupy movement a few weeks later rise up. And they came together with us. Some of you were in Washington on November 4th when we encircled the White House, 5 deep in people, demanding an end to this Keystone project. And that actually worked. 4 days later, the president said, okay, we're going to take another year to look at this carefully. That was a good thing to do. It did not sit well with the fossil fuel industry, and they went right back to work and got their bought and paid for, their harem in Congress. The senators and representatives who were basically on their payroll, they got them to try and revive this project, and they pushed through a bill to demand that it get speeded up. And then the president, to his great credit, said, no, we're going to deny this permit. He said it even though the American Petroleum Institute, aka Big Oil, had said, we will exact huge political consequences from you if you don't grant this permit. And they have the money to do it. So you can tell I'm not always, an inveterate fan of the president. I got arrested for sitting in outside his house. But in this case, he did the brave thing, he stood up, and that was good to see. And the reason he stood up is because we stood up, because you stood up, because we showed him that there was support and demand for real action on the things that he had campaigned on. This battle's far from over. Big Oil's back at work in Congress. It would be a big help if you could remind Senator Tester and Senator Baucus and any other senators out in that direction that you don't want this Keystone pipeline. We tried to remind them actually pretty effectively 5 days ago when we got all the environmental groups in the country to come together for a day, and together managed to send in 24 hours 800,000 messages to the U.S. Senate. We did not, we said we were going to try for 500,000, and we thought that was an astonishing number, and we didn't know if we could do it, but we figured we better go for broke. We went by 500,000 in about 7 hours. In fact, I got the news that we'd gone past 500,000 just as I went on the set to tape the Colbert Show that night. And it made me in a good mood for that always very scary encounter of going on Colbert, which went all right. I survived. It was great. One American in 400 on the same day sent a message to the Senate about this one pipeline. It's a sign that we've got this movement building But of course, we're behind. We're losing. There are so many fronts, so many places we have to take on. This whole absurd world of extreme energy that we're now starting to delve into. It's not just tar sands. It's fracking for gas across and oil across the country. That is exploding the subsurface geology to get more of it to flow. It's doing drilling, mile beneath the ocean in a place where we clearly have no way of dealing with problems when they erupt. It's doing the kind of wholesale coal mining in the mountaintop areas of the Appalachians or out there in the Montana and the Powder River Basin and all those places that are determined to become the coal mine for the entire planet. And we're trying to slow down the tar sands, we've got to slow down that. The good news is that we can, that these places are geographically isolated from the markets that they need to reach, and hence we have some chance of trying to slow them down. I was just out in Bellingham, Washington a few months ago, where they're trying to build one of the big ports to take the coal from Montana and ship it to China to get burned. We rallied 1,000 people on the village green. That's a huge percentage of their population. They want to stop that port. People up and down the Pacific coast. I'm headed to Vancouver in a few days for the same kind of thing. We need people there in the Rocky Mountains to try and slow down that coal at the source. And I know that people are beginning to talk about actions at the Montana Land Board and things as the summer goes on. August 20th, I think, was the last date I heard, where people will come together to do this kind of work. Look, all of it's important. All of it's connected. We need to think of it and talk about it and act on it, not just as a series of isolated things that we're working on, tar sands or coal mining or anything else. We need to understand that this is a movement, that we're all together in a big and hopefully bigger all the time movement, and that there are different fronts in that movement, just as the civil rights movement worked in lots of different states and lots of different cities. Some people were working on lunch counters and some on voting rights and some, but it was all the same movement. That's what we are. And we're in a, well, look, I'm not an organizer by training or background. I'm a writer, which means in some ways I'm terrible at this. I mean, I'm the kind of person that really left to his own devices would just sit in his room and type. I'm not good at speaking and organizing and all that kind of stuff, but I've tried to kind of learn, and we need you to try and kind of learn and do all that you can. And you've got to do it, and this is the hard part, you've got to do it with no guarantee that we're going to win. Now, there are scientists who think we may have waited too long to get started, and there are political scientists who think the odds are just too high, and maybe they're right. I mean, so far we've mostly lost. I suppose if you were a betting person, you'd bet that we were going to lose in the future, but you can't make that bet. The stakes are just too high, and so we need to go to work with everything we've got, even not knowing if we're going to win or not. When we did those arrest actions in Washington, one of the things we said was that when people came to get arrested, we wanted them to be wearing a necktie or a dress, okay? Not because, I mean, I live in Vermont. You see how I dress most of the time. I'm not a big fan of neckties, but we need a way to remind people all the time in everything we do the essential fact here, which is who the radicals are in this fight. And they are not us, okay? We are trying to keep the world in something like the state in which we found it. The radicals work at oil companies and coal companies and gas companies. They are willing, indeed, they are hard at work fighting to alter the chemical composition of the atmosphere. Nothing more radical has ever been done by human beings. I mean, if you were writing the next James Bond movie, the villain would be like, give me $1 trillion or I will alter the chemical composition of the atmosphere, okay? That's what Exxon sets out to do, and Scholl and everybody else, every single day of the year. All right? They're the radicals, and we're the voice of common sense here, but we've got to be the voice of firm common sense. And we've got to be willing to lay it on the line. Don't think that you're alone. One of the other things we said when we did those arrests in Washington was that we didn't think college kids should be the ones who had to be the kind of cannon fodder for the whole thing. Because, you know, some of us have spent 50 years pouring carbon into the atmosphere, and also because at your age, you have to be a little careful about getting an arrest record in this economy. Past a certain age, you know, what are they going to do to you? You know, not much. So we didn't actually ask people how old they were, because that would be rude, but we asked them who was president when you were born, okay? And the two biggest groups of people who got arrested had been born in the Harry Truman and Franklin Delano Roosevelt administrations, okay? So that made me super happy. Young people have been in the lead of this fight all along and will be in the lead of this fight all along. And nobody's been more important than Energy Action and the kind of power shift movement. And I know that because it's now spread around the world. I've talked at Power Shift Australia and Power Shift Sweden and Power Shift UK and all kinds of places. So young people always in the lead. But it is good to know now that other people are starting to step up too. When we look at the pictures that flood in from around the world to 350.org, and we've now organized about 20,000 demonstrations in, as I said before, every country on earth except North Korea. When we look at those pictures, we realize that most of the people that we work with around the world are poor and black and brown and Asian and young, because that's what most of the world is made up of. And I want you to realize that you are a part of a big, broad movement. It's the most important movement there's ever been. It's a movement fighting not just for our own future, but for the future of every generation that comes after us, to try and keep the planet as intact as possible. And I don't know how it's going to come out. All I know is it's a great honor to get to fight shoulder to shoulder with you, and I will very much look forward to doing that in the years ahead. Thank you all very, very much.